To get started with our webinar, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Sergio Nieto. Welcome, Doctor. Dr. Sergio Nieto-Montenegro obtained his doctorate in food science at University of Penn State, and he directs the Food and Nutrition Group based in Chihuahua and El Paso, Texas, where he works as a specialist in translating science and technology information into the language of growers and processors through training programs. This group has developed programs for the American Mushroom Institute, the National Mango Board, Arizona and California LGMA, the citrus, apple, papaya, and avocado industries, the International Fresh Produce Association, and others. The company has more than 50 training apps on the App Store, and it has implemented programs in more than 18 different countries. Since 2013, Food Safety CTS has developed the food safety and social responsibility programs for the National Mango Board. And with that introduction, I'm very happy to turn it over to Dr. Nieto. Hello, thank you so much, Natalia. Welcome to everyone to this National Mango Board webinar, where we will be talking about agricultural water use. So let's get started. We're going to talk about the implementation of the final FSMA rule regarding pre-harvest water, though I will have a couple slides regarding post-harvest water use. Let's start by defining the food safety law, the produce safety rule in English. As many of you know, the FSMA law was passed around 2011, and FSMA has 7 rules. One of those rules has to do with fresh produce food safety, which are the standards for the growing, harvesting, packaging, and storage of fresh produce for human consumption. These standards have different subparts, and the subpart that we're going to talk about today has to do with subpart E, which is agricultural water. So we're going to talk about some of the changes that have come down regarding agricultural water use. But to get started, I'd like to start by defining what is agricultural water. Agricultural water means water used in the activities covered by the standard, where the water has or would likely to have contact with the product or food contact surfaces. So in a mango orchard, for example, under that classification, mango is a product covered by the rule or subject to the standards of the rule. And agricultural water would be defined as water through any activity in the orchard touches the mangoes or touches any food contact surface. For example, it could touch the water during irrigation if you have sprayers. And I'm talking about the harvestable portion of the crop. So, spraying of pesticides, irrigation, when I wash the buckets, or water used for washing hands, when that water comes in contact with the mango or food contact surfaces, it is called agricultural water. So we do have agricultural water in pre-harvest that is in contact with water, and this can take place during any of these activities. Irrigation, fertigation, foliar spray. This would not apply for mangoes, but also when water rather comes in contact with a food contact surface during harvest or post-harvest. So this is water that is used, for example, for washing buckets or baskets, water that is used for washing hands, water used for washing knives, anything that may have come into contact with the product or food contact surfaces. So if a orchard uses water that is not included in this definition, that water is not subject to the rule. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you irrigate your orchard using gravity or a drip system. That water does not touch the product, and so it is not agricultural water. So let's say that you don't spray, no spraying at all. Well, then you would not have agricultural water in your orchard during pre-harvest. But the harvesters come in and wash their hands. So then you would have agricultural water during the harvest and post-harvest. Before I go on, I would like to show you a little video so that it will be very clear what agricultural water is, because it's very important to understand whether or not my orchard has agricultural water. If I do not have agricultural water on my orchard, then none of these rules apply to my operation. So let's look at the video quickly. The food safety rule for fresh produce defines agricultural water as water used in the activities covered by the rule for fresh produce products that are covered by the rule, where water may have contact with the fruit or food contact surfaces. Covered fresh produce are produce that are subject to the requirements of the rule. The term covered produce refers to the harvestable or harvested portion of the crop. Agricultural water may be used in pre harvest or post harvest, including irrigation, water used to apply sprays, water for protecting against freezing, water to cool, and water that is used in mixes that are applied directly to the product prior to harvest. Agricultural water may be used before or after harvest. This may include water used in the fields during the harvest, during packing, or during storage activities. This water includes water used for washing and cooling fresh produce, as well as water used to prevent dehydration. Other water used in post harvest include producing ice, water used for mixing and applying fungicides for hand washing, and cleaning and disinfecting activities. If an orchard uses water that does not meet this definition, this water is not subject to compliance with the requirements of the rule regarding agricultural water. For example, water that does not have any contact with fresh produce is not considered agricultural water, as is the case of water used for drip irrigation, for example, in an avocado field. However, that same water, regardless of its origin, would be considered agricultural water if it's used to prepare a mix of agricultural chemicals applied directly to the avocados. The FDA is evaluating manners of simplifying the rule and proposed an extension of the dates for compliance with this rule for products subject to the rule, with the exception of certain products. Review the dates that apply to your orchard. Thank you for watching this video. Please follow us at www.extension.psu.edu/FSMA. This program was developed by Food Safety CTS LLC for its Food Safety and Sustainability Training Program of the USDA and Kent State University. Well, what do you think about the video? I'd like to ask you this question. Do you have agricultural water in your orchard? Yes or no? That would be the first thing that we would need to ask ourselves. Are we dealing with water that come in direct contact with the product or food contact services? If the answer is yes, then the provisions of the rule apply. If the answer is no, if you do not have agricultural water, then you would not be subject to this subpart of the rule. So we were talking about pre-harvest. That refers to water used during harvest that has direct contact with the product. We're talking about fertigation, irrigation, and other activities. The dates for compliance for agricultural water for production or pre-harvest is April 7th of 2025 is that date for farms that sell more than $500 million per year. Companies that sell between $250,000 and $500,000 a year. The date is April 7th of 2026, and for very small companies, it is April 7th of 2027. So companies that sell between $25,000 and $250,000 per year. So what changed? The rule was published, and then they decided to modify it. So the rule was published, there was a public comment period, and then after the public comments, the final rule was published. The FDA published the final rule regarding agricultural water used during pre-harvest. So, what is the premise of what subpart E tells us regarding produce? Well, it says that all agricultural water must be safe and must have proper sanitary qualities and health qualities for the use involved. So, we'd have to ask then first if the water used in your orchard comes into direct contact with the mango. So we could look at this spray that obviously when it's watering, this water will have contact with the mango directly. So your water, if it is agricultural water, it must be safe. It cannot be contaminated and it must be of quality that is sufficient for this use. So there are different sources of water which represent different risks. So the safest water is municipal water or that water that comes from cisterns or pipes. Then we have underground water, water that comes from a well, and surface water, which would be water that you obtain through channels. So, well water is underground water, and surface water is water that comes from channels, from lagoons, from reservoirs, from rivers. In some cases, you take water out of a well and you store it in a reservoir. So this water was underground water and it becomes surface water. So, regardless of the source of water, I have to ask if my water has direct contact with the harvestable portion of my product, and that if it does, it is agricultural water. Well, once I know that I have agricultural water, then that water must be safe for that use. Now, I could irrigate, and when I apply these materials, when I am applying a pesticide, then I would have agricultural water when the harvestable portion is on the tree. There are different types of irrigation, spraying or by flooding, and they all have different sources. Also, the time of application represents different risks. So when you are about to harvest the fruit, that risk goes down. So basically, we have to ask this question in order to determine which parts of the rule apply. Does the water come into contact with the mangoes?
And if the water has contact with mango, then it means that we have agricultural water. If that's the case, then you need to comply with the requirements of the final rule, subpart E, which is agricultural water used during pre-harvest. That specific section states that each orchard will determine the quality of the water that will be used in agriculture through an evaluation or assessment of the agricultural water. You will need to perform an assessment of the whole system. I'm not referring to an analysis. You will need to assess the whole system. And in this webinar, I will give you a general explanation on how you can perform this assessment that will cover all of your water systems. The rule is no longer based on the microbiological analysis. In the first subpart that was published, the rule required for you to perform a profile of the microbiological quality of your water. However, this has been eliminated. Now, the final rule for agricultural water in pre-harvest is asking you to perform an assessment of all of your water systems that will be used pre-harvest. The expectation is that you, as a producer, you need to establish your own standards and you need to understand why the criteria that you used or why you are considering that the water that you're using has good quality for your orchard. And then you need to be prepared to explain and justify your choices when you have FDA inspectors coming to see you. And I can't speak on behalf of the FDA because I don't work at the FDA. However, I can explain to you what the rule states. And the expectation is that you need to establish your own standards and you need to understand why the criteria that you are using are adequate for your orchard. And I always need to think that all the agricultural water needs to be safe and with a sufficient sanitary quality for your use. We need to understand very well everything that we're doing. And there are certain key points that I would like to go over with. The first one is to perform an assessment of agricultural water or your water systems. And the second part would be to seek to comply with exemption. There are ways to obtain an exemption. One would be through the treatment of agricultural water. Another way would be through public water supply. And then another one would be through the use of untreated underground water that will comply with certain microbiological criteria. I will go back to this topic at the very end, where I will be focusing on how to perform an assessment of agricultural water. There is a concept from the 2015 rule that said that you had to inspect and maintain your agricultural water systems. It had to be at least once a year, where you had to inspect all of your water systems within your orchard if they are under your management, so that you can identify safety hazards for fresh produce. And this is something that the 2015 rule was requiring. That rule required you to perform an inspection of all of your water systems that are under your management in your orchard. And this is an inspection that needs to be documented. After the inspection, you are required to maintain your systems. And maintenance includes periodically monitoring of each system, correction of any deficiencies that you might identify, properly store equipment and keep the source of water free of debris, and how to keep the distribution system also clean. Your water system is your source, is also your distribution system or your storage system. That is, your pipes, your tanks are also part of your water system. Now, the 2015 rule included another part, which was inspection and maintenance of your agricultural water, which stated that you were required to inspect and monitor your systems to make sure that the systems are properly working, that they have not been contaminated. However, all of these will now be activities that you will be performing for your systems that are under your management. However, the agricultural water assessment will include other things that are not under your control, and we will also review that. The AGWA, is the agricultural water assessment, and this is the new part within the new rule. You, as a grower, will need to evaluate various factors to identify conditions that could reasonably introduce known or reasonably foreseeable hazards to fresh produce that are covered by the law or on surfaces that come in contact with food. You will need to assess several factors within your water system that could potentially contaminate your produce or the surface that is in contact with your water. This is a very simple way of explaining what the agricultural water assessment is. You need to evaluate your water systems, but not only the ones that are under your management, but also things that are out of your control. You will see if you need to take certain measures to reduce the potential of contamination of the produce or the surfaces that come in contact with food. And you will need to do that at the beginning of the season, but at least once a year or any time that there's a significant change. Now, let's see specifically, what do I need to assess? Well, first of all, you need to provide an assessment in writing. The assessment of the agricultural water distribution system that's under your management will be part of that. It will give you information, it will give you tools to perform the assessment of all your system. The assessment will need to be in writing, and then you will need to see what's the location and nature of the water source. You need to ask yourself, what's your water source? Is it from a well? Or are you using water from a reservoir that's located, I don't know, 40 kilometers away from your site? What type of water distribution system are you using, both in your orchard and also outside of your orchard? Or where does this water flow into? Does it go through open channels, through a main pipeline, or are you using your water from a well? And all of the water will go through a closed system with pipes. Or maybe I take water from a well and then I store it in a reservoir. And what's the protection level of that reservoir? If I use water from a well, that belongs to me, but then I store it in a bigger reservoir, and that's a bigger reservoir where you have ducks or you have cows that can drink water from it, like the picture that we are seeing on the slide? Or do I have a mesh around it or a fence so that animals can't have access to it? This would be a degree of protection against potential contamination sources. If I have channels, what happens in the channel or the canals? Let's assume that there is an operation next to my orchard that produces compost and they have manure. And maybe there's particles of that waste that can contaminate my water. That means that it's no longer safe. So all of these are elements that I need to include in my agricultural water assessment. I need to assess my distribution system, the location and nature of my water source, where my canals are starting. If I have canals going through a village where there are people washing clothes, where there are people swimming, also access to animals. Is it an area where animals can swim? This would all go into the agricultural water assessment so that I can identify conditions that could reasonably introduce known or reasonable foreseeable hazards. And this will also help me to determine if I need to undertake either corrective or mitigation measures. For instance, if I'm doing mitigation of this canal, well, the cows are walking by, right? But how often do they go by this area? And are they going to cross the canal? Because it would be different if they are on one side or if suddenly three or four or five cows need to go to the bathroom and they do it in the canal. Well, maybe this is 3 kilometers before my orchard. Maybe they come every day. So this is all part of the things that I need to assess in order to determine if the water will be safe and if it will have the adequate sanitary quality for my uses. Now, it's important to say that this is not a prescriptive norm. The rule is very flexible. So the rule asks you to go and determine and inspect the water to see if it's adequate. Another thing that has to do with writing this assessment is the practices that I use, the application of irrigation that I use, as well as foliar applications. Maybe I use water from the canal, which is surface water for my irrigation. And there I don't have agricultural water. And then I use my water from my well for foliar applications when there is fruit. Now, the water sources can be different, right? But I need to put everything in writing for my assessment. And I need to be able to explain why my water has sufficient sanitary quality, or why there is reasonable or there is not reasonable or foreseeable sources of contamination. We also need to take into account what's the time interval between when I'm sourcing water or when I'm using it for harvest. And I need to take into account the microbiological rate. Now, the rule was not created specifically for mango crops, it was created for several crops. So I need to see if my product has characteristics that will allow for growth. So, what are the characteristics of the mango? If the water can contaminate my fruit. So you will need to do some research in order to find out all of these answers. Also, environmental conditions are important and we need to include them in the assessment. For instance, frequency of heavy rains or extreme climate events. What happens if suddenly, let's suppose that we have a reservoir and suddenly there's a big storm and the whole reservoir is agitated. So, will the quality of water change after a big storm? And am I going to apply this water to my produce? These are all factors that I need to take into account for my agricultural water assessment. I would like to insist I need to take care of my environment, who's next to me, who are my neighbors, where are my canals. For instance, this is a mango orchard that I saw yesterday. We need to ask ourselves what's going on here. Is there waste here? Am I going to use this water for my applications? Maybe the water here is not clean. And maybe it's crystal clear when I have it in my area and it's very easy to treat it. These are all things that I need to include in my assessment. Or maybe I need to ask for an exemption and I want to be completely exempt because I will treat first my water for my applications. So these are the things that I need to include in my assessment.
The evaluation does not require an analysis. The analysis can be part of the evaluation, but they're not the only part. Some things that I'm frequently asked are, well, but I'm doing my own testing. So I'm on the other side of that now. I don't have to do testing of agricultural water. But the answer is no. The answer is no. Tests are part of the evaluation. And they can help you to collect information that will be part of your written evaluation. And this assessment, this test is going to allow you to make decisions. E. coli and other microorganisms that one can test for are useful. These tests are useful, but they aren't a basis for making all decisions. But you can use what you already do, but that is not the entire evaluation. Testing is part of your evaluation process only. The FDA published this sheet regarding risks. And once I do my evaluation to identify conditions that may reasonably introduce known dangers or reasonably predictable dangers or risks with mangoes, then that will allow me to determine whether or not I need to take measures to reduce the likelihood of contamination of the product or surfaces. And these results will be based on the things that I evaluate that I just explained. And so if I determine that the agricultural water is not safe or is not of sufficient quality for this use, I'm going to immediately have to stop using it and implement corrective measures before I go back to using that water. If the answer here is no, so the question is, does nearby land have the potential to introduce risks because of soil amendments or human waste or animal waste? If the answer is yes to this question, then I must implement mitigation measures quickly and not at the end of the current season. But if the answer is no, there is no likelihood of introducing a danger from animals or soil amendments or human waste, then I can go on to the next question. Are there other conditions that might reasonably introduce known dangers or could also introduce risks in the product or surfaces? If the answer is yes, then I have to implement mitigation measures as quickly as possible. But it may be either of these two. I'm going to analyze the water as part of the evaluation to determine if I have to implement preventive measures. So you have to ask what happened, what you found during the evaluation. Upon reviewing your practices, the weather and environmental conditions and other elements, and then I have to look at what I have to do, whether I have to implement a corrective measure or a mitigation measure either immediately or can I wait till the end of the season, but not to the next year? So if the answer is no, if there's nothing that can cause problems with my water, I can go forward with inspections and periodic maintenance of the systems for my agricultural water. Now, here I mentioned corrective measures and mitigation measures. Corrective measures are more strict. They're measures that I must take immediately. And here we have a couple examples of corrective measures. So if I find, for example, that my water is not safe, not hygienic, I have to inspect the entire water system and make changes or treat the water. And mitigation measures give you a little bit more flexibility. They're more lax, we could say. So these are things that you can do. For example, you can repair your water system, change your application methods. The mitigation measures are measures that are more flexible. And I really liked this concept in the rule that corrective measures are measures that you must implement immediately because the water is not safe, is not of the proper quality. And mitigation measures are measures that you can work on, that if you found some minor issues, measures that you can work on to minimize the risk of contamination of your water. Now, exemptions, let's talk about exemptions. Orchards are exempt of analysis of pre-harvest water if the water meets certain criteria of the agricultural water use during harvest and post-harvest. For example, if there's a microbiological criterion in the rule, so the water that I use must not have any E. coli in a 100 milliliter sample. So if I use water from a well, let's say that I have a mango farm and I irrigate with water from canals. That is water that does not touch the product, but I do foliar treatments with water from a well. So that water does come in contact with the harvestable portion of the crop. The rule indicates that if the water meets the conditions for agricultural water, I can get an exemption, but I have to support it with records. So, what does that part of the rule tell me? For post harvest water, agricultural water, it says that I have to do 4 tests during the first season and E. coli must be absent in a sample of 100 milliliters. And thereafter, I have to do a yearly analysis of that well. However, that is with the understanding that the quality of the water is not going to change, that it is reasonable to presume that that water quality is not going to change between the well and when that water comes into contact with the fruit. Another way of obtaining an exemption from evaluating the water would be if I receive the water from a public source that meets the established standards. For example, something that I've seen is that in some cases you use water from canals to irrigate, but other systems use cisterns with potable water that are purchased from the city or a private vendor. So I would need a certificate, a compliance certificate in that case for that water, or results of tests on the public water to obtain that exemption. And I'm going to use that water for certain activities, such as applications of pesticides, for example, when the harvestable portion of the crop will come in contact with these mixtures. And the third way is if the water is treated according to the standards described by the FSMA produce safety rule. If I have agricultural water that is treated, and this is a scientifically valid treatment, then that water, if it comes into contact with the harvestable portion of the crop during pre-harvest, then I can obtain an exemption. So, how does this happen in practice? Well, in some cases, some farms have drip irrigation or gravity irrigation where the water does not touch the mangoes. But then in their applications, they take water from a reservoir or a well and they treat that water with an antimicrobial product using a treatment that is scientifically valid. So, in that case, you would be able to obtain an exemption. However, it's important to note that I'm not saying you need to treat the water. I'm only saying that agricultural water, water that does not touch the mangoes, is not subject to any of this. So, I'm just explaining how you can obtain certain exemptions, and these exemptions must be supported by records. So, we'll go on now to records. These are the records that I have to keep. The findings from the inspections of the agricultural water evaluations after 2015, which I explained, which will be part of your written evaluation of the agricultural water. including descriptions of all the tests that you did and the results in written form or documentation to support the exemption that you have obtained. If you do an analysis of the water as part of your evaluation, you'll have to have the records to back that up, the results, the methods used, and when you use another organism that's not E. coli, why did you use that other organism? So you must have those records. If you use agricultural water from a public source, you have to document that on an annual basis. You have to document the results of tests or certificates of compliance. And when you have to take measures as a result of your evaluation of agricultural water, you must document the measures that you implemented and the reasons. So basically, we just went over the new requirements for agricultural water in pre-harvest. I have 2 slides about agricultural water during harvest and post-harvest. Remember, it's different than pre-harvest water. And I'm just going to include them here just to remind you that these are other requirements that are more strict. Water used in harvest and post-harvest is water that is used prior to or after harvest, and it's used for rinsing or washing the product, to cool the product, and others. But generally, we use it for washing hands and for cleaning and disinfecting in mango orchards. So, something that you need to take into account is that you cannot use surface water that has not been treated for any of these activities. That is, if you have a hand washing station in your orchard, you cannot use water from a canal that has not been treated and use it for hand washing. This water must be treated, and there are criteria that you have to meet. Absence of E. coli in a 100 milliliter sample. Also, if you wash baskets or trays or buckets in your orchard, you must use water that also shows an absence of E. coli in 100 milliliters, and you cannot use surface water that is not treated for any of these activities. Now, I also wanted to talk about the dates for compliance. Large companies last year had to be in compliance already with this rule. This year, for small companies must be in compliance with this. And on January 26th of 2025, very small companies that sell between $25,000 and $250,000 will have to comply with this rule for agricultural water during harvest and post-harvest and pre-harvest. So this has to do with much more strict requirements because there's a greater risk. So to conclude, what did we talk about here? We talked about the FSMA law with the produce rules, and the produce rule includes the agricultural water rule, and we have pre-harvest water as well as harvest and post-harvest water. We focused today on the new requirements that you must comply with in pre-harvest agricultural water. The premise is that all agricultural water must be safe and must be of sufficient quality for these uses.
And we talked about some of the requirements. One of the requirements that didn't change is that you need to do an inspection of your water systems. You need to perform an assessment of everything that has to do with water that's under your management. And something that's new is the agricultural water assessment. This is a written assessment where you need to record certain aspects. For instance, what's your water source? What are your distribution systems? What's the type of irrigation that you use? Who are your neighbors? Where is this water coming from? And these are all factors that will help you determine if there is a reasonable risk of contamination of your fruits. And then if there is a risk, then you need to take measures. They can be mitigation or correction measures. Finally, we went over the 3 ways of how you can apply for an exemption for this rule. And we talked a little bit about water during harvest and water use post harvest. Here you have my information, and thank you so much for attending this webinar. Natalia, I don't know if there is some time for a couple of questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Nieto. Yes, we do have time for questions. We have a question from Roberto asking for water coming from a well for pre-harvest and post-harvest, do we need to have microbiological records? Yes, Roberto. This is a very good question. This is actually not a direct question. Let's see. If you use water from a well, this is the first thing that I would like to ask. Actually, what do you think if I ask you questions and you can reply to me in the chat? Let's see that I'm using water from a well and I'm using that water to irrigate my mango orchards. Is that correct? Yes? Okay. That water will touch my mangoes? Yes or no? The answer is no. Okay, then it's not agricultural water. You don't need to perform the assessment. If you take water from the well and you put it in a tank, and with that water you irrigate, yes or not? Yes. Is there fruit present in that irrigation? Yes or no? I'm loving it. I'm loving this dialogue. Yes, there is fruit. Okay, then there you do have agricultural water. You're not exempt. You need to perform your assessment, with the exception that this water can be applicable for an exemption. Let's see. Let's take that well. That water that you use from the well, do you use it from the well directly into your tank for your irrigation, or first do you send it to a reservoir? And then you take it from the reservoir directly to your application tank. Okay, and then that water from your application tank, are you applying any treatment with antimicrobial products? Yes or no? If the answer is no, then we need to see if on that well you've been doing different analysis during your season 4 analysis. If you performed 4 analysis, and in your 4 analysis you have an absence of E. coli in a 100 milliliter sample, then you are eligible for an exemption. It's 4 tests. Remember, those 4 tests, if there's an absence of E. coli in a 100 milliliter sample, then yes. Then you are eligible for an exemption. But every year you need to repeat the same analysis because you are complying with one of the most strict requirements for the use of water for both harvest and post-harvest. With the understanding that the water will not change. This was great. I loved it. How we were able to review that case. Now, this is water that you may also use for hand washing, right? It will depend on if you want to treat it or not. And you need to be able to explain all of that in the case that you have an inspection. I hope that I made myself clear, Roberto. It was crystal clear, yes. Great. Hand washing water needs to be treated with chlorine. Yes, that's great. That's great, both for during harvest and post-harvest. And I guess that the water that you use to clean and disinfect your baskets and buckets is also treated. Now, all the orchards are different, so this is why this rule is challenging. And I hope that the audience can understand that because, this is a rule that cannot be applied with a one size fits all approach. It's a very flexible rule, and only you can determine if your water is safe and if it has this sanitary quality that's sufficient for your uses. Roberto, I loved your questions. Where are you located, Roberto? In Guatemala. Great, great. Sergio, we wanted to clarify something. So, what happens if the water has contact with the plant but not with the fruit? There's no mango present. Let's see. Because it's not the mango that we need to consider, it's the harvestable portion of it. Even if there's the little flower where the mango comes out from, then this is the harvestable portion, right? Then yes. However, if there's no flower, no nothing, then no, there's no harvestable portion. Yes, thank you for the distinction. There's another question. Could you give an example of what foreseeable conditions could mean? You know what? I don't think I can answer that. This is something that I was discussing yesterday, and I was here in Peru talking about this. And I saw a lot of the water sources. We even went to the main source. We went to see the canals. And this is something that you need to see on a case by case basis. You know, after what I saw yesterday, that I saw a large part of where the water flows from the canal, from the mouth of the reservoir, every orchard is different. So what happens if there's a cow that crosses the canal and they go to the bathroom? Well, that's different if it's before or after your orchard, right? What happens if you're on the top and the company that produces compost is around the water and maybe the wind could bring waste particles to your water? Then what happens if I have a well that's been perforated under the soil? However, it's not covered and there can be contamination of the well. So it's very, very hard to give you a general answer. We need to analyze it case by case. We have one last question. You said that we need to keep records of the corrective measures that we take, correct? Yes. For instance, I treated my water, and then you keep a record of that, of my treatment. Distribution fixes, yes. Whatever you did. But it has to be very simple, right? This is my own opinion, Sergio's opinion. Certain records need to include certain elements required by the rule, but it's key to document everything in a very simple way so that everybody can understand it and so that you can be able to explain it. If we don't have any more questions from the chat, well, you're always welcome to contact Mr. Nieto at any time about your questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Nieto. And I would like to invite you on our next webinar, which will be on October 24th on the NMB Marketing Team's 2024 and 2025 strategy and updates. It will be by Daniel Spellman. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you and have a great afternoon. Bye bye.